In the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district, where power brokers move billions with the click of a button, Marcus Blackwood built an empire that touched every corner of the pharmaceutical world. His company, Blackwood Industries, owned patents on life-saving medications, controlled supply chains across 6 continents, and generated profits that could fund small nations. Yet for all his wealth and influence, Marcus himself remained trapped in a prison of his own making, haunted by a single moment that had shattered his faith in everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years ago, his younger sister Diana had collapsed during a family dinner, her brilliant mind suddenly seized by a rare neurological condition that left her in a vegetative state. The best doctors, the most expensive treatments, the cutting-edge research his own company funded, none of it could bring back the woman who had once challenged him to use his wealth for something greater than profit. Now she lay in a private medical facility, surrounded by machines that kept her body alive while her consciousness remained locked away, unreachable. Marcus threw himself into work with the fury of a man trying to outrun guilt. His days blurred between board meetings and pharmaceutical conferences, chasing the next breakthrough that might justify his existence. But in the sterile corridors of his 50-story headquarters, where every surface gleamed and every employee moved with corporate precision, something was about to happen that would shatter his carefully controlled world. Rosa Martinez had been invisible for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. For 18 months, she had arrived at Blackwood Industries every morning at 4:30, when the security guards were still drowsy and the executive floors empty. She moved through the marble lobbies and mahogany-paneled offices like a ghost, her cleaning cartwheels whispering against polished floors, her presence so routine that even the cameras seemed to ignore her. At 52, Rosa carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming small. Her hands, weathered from years of cleaning solutions and hard work, moved with practiced efficiency as she emptied trash bins and wiped down conference tables where decisions worth millions were made. She spoke little English beyond what was necessary for her job, and the few employees who encountered her in the early morning hours rarely looked at her long enough to see the intelligence that flickered behind her tired eyes. But Rosa harbored a secret that would have astonished the executives who walked past her without acknowledgement. Hidden in the basement storage room of her small Queens apartment building, she had constructed something that defied every assumption about who she was and what she was capable of creating. The storage room had once held nothing but forgotten furniture and boxes of holiday decorations. Over the course of 5 years, Rosa had transformed it into something extraordinary. She had soundproofed the walls with materials scavenged from construction sites, installed ventilation she'd learned to build from YouTube videos, and assembled equipment piece by piece from online auctions and second-hand medical supply stores. The space hummed with the quiet efficiency of a laboratory that would have impressed researchers at any major university. Rosa's transformation of that forgotten basement room had begun during the darkest period of her life. Her youngest daughter, Carmen, had been diagnosed with the same rare neurological condition that would later claim Marcus Blackwood's sister. But Rosa didn't have billions of dollars or connections to elite medical institutions. She had watched helplessly as Carmen's seizures grew more frequent and severe, as traditional treatments failed one after another, as the medical bills mounted beyond anything her cleaning jobs could cover. The night Carmen died, Rosa had made a promise that seemed impossible for a woman with a high school education and no formal scientific training. She would find a way to ensure that other mothers wouldn't have to watch their children slip away from a disease that the medical establishment had essentially abandoned. It was a promise born of grief and fury, but it was also a promise that tapped into something Rosa had hidden from the world for decades. As a child in El Salvador, Rosa had been the daughter of a rural teacher who recognized her exceptional mind and sacrificed everything to keep her in school. She had shown a natural aptitude for chemistry and biology that her teachers called extraordinary. But war had torn her country apart when she was 16, forcing her family to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. In America, survival had meant abandoning dreams of university and research for the immediate necessity of work, any work that would keep her family fed and housed. For 35 years, Rosa had pushed her intellectual curiosity into the corners of her life, reading scientific journals in the library during her lunch breaks, teaching herself advanced chemistry from textbooks she bought used online. She learned to speak the language of molecular biology and neuropharmacology the same way she had learned to speak English, slowly, carefully, with a determination that bordered on obsession. The storage room laboratory was where those decades of hidden learning finally found expression. Rosa had spent 3 years researching her daughter's condition, diving deep into medical databases and research papers that most people couldn't access or understand. She discovered that the pharmaceutical companies, including Marcus Blackwood's empire, had largely abandoned research into rare neurological conditions because the profit margins were too small. There simply weren't enough patients to justify the massive costs of developing new treatments. But Rosa had found something in the literature that the corporate researchers had missed. Deep in the archives of a defunct pharmaceutical company, she had uncovered research from the 1970s that pointed toward a completely different approach to treating neurological disorders. The original researchers had been working on compounds derived from a specific type of deep-sea algae, but the project had been abandoned when the company had been acquired and their priorities shifted toward more commercially viable drugs. Rosa's work built on that forgotten foundation, but she approached it from an angle that would have been impossible within the constraints of corporate research. She wasn't bound by quarterly profit targets or patent considerations. She wasn't limited by the narrow focus that characterized most pharmaceutical development. Instead, she was driven by the memory of her daughter's final months and the knowledge that somewhere, other families were facing the same devastating diagnosis. Her breakthrough had come 6 months ago, though she didn't fully understand its significance at the time. Working with equipment that cost less than what Marcus Blackwood spent on a single business lunch, Rosa had synthesized a compound that showed remarkable promise in the cell cultures she was able to maintain in her makeshift laboratory. The compound seemed to repair the specific type of neural damage that characterized the rare condition, essentially rebuilding the pathways that the disease destroyed. But Rosa faced an impossible barrier. She had no credentials, no institutional affiliation, no way to access the resources needed to properly test her discovery. She had tried reaching out to researchers at universities, but her emails went unanswered. She had attempted to contact pharmaceutical companies, but her calls were transferred to junior assistants who politely took messages that were never returned. In the world of medical research, Rosa Martinez simply didn't exist. So she continued her work in secret, refining her compound, documenting her results with the meticulous care of a trained scientist. She created detailed logs of every experiment, photographed every slide, recorded every observation. She knew that someday, somehow, she would need to prove what she had accomplished. But she also knew that revealing her work prematurely could lead to it being stolen, patented, and profited from by the same companies that had ignored her attempts to collaborate. The irony was not lost on her that every morning, she cleaned the offices of the very people who could have helped her bring her discovery to the world. As she emptied the trash bins of pharmaceutical executives and wiped down the desks where decisions about medical research were made, Rosa carried with her the knowledge that she might have developed something that could save countless lives. But in those gleaming corporate offices, she remained invisible, just another member of the cleaning staff whose presence was taken for granted. Rosa's routine at Blackwood Industries had become as precise as the experiments she conducted in her secret laboratory. She knew every security camera's blind spot, every guard's pattern, every executive's schedule. She had learned to read the emotions in the offices she cleaned, the stress in crumpled papers, the triumph in champagne glasses left in conference rooms, the desperation in pharmaceutical journals left open to articles about failed clinical trials. It was this intimate knowledge of the building's rhythms that allowed Rosa to notice when something changed in Marcus Blackwood's routine. The CEO, who typically worked late into the night, had begun leaving earlier, his office often dark by 8 o'clock. His trash bin, once filled with the detritus of a workaholic's life, now contained prescription bottles and medical appointment cards. Rosa recognized the signs of someone grappling with illness, either their own or that of someone close to them. She had also begun to notice the increased security presence in the building. New cameras had been installed in areas that had previously been unmonitored. Additional guards had been hired, men with military bearing who watched everything with suspicious eyes. The atmosphere in the building had shifted from corporate efficiency to something approaching paranoia, though Rosa couldn't understand why. What she didn't know was that Marcus Blackwood had received death threats from families affected by his company's pricing policies on essential medications. Desperate parents who couldn't afford the drugs their children needed had begun targeting pharmaceutical executives with an anger that sometimes crossed into violence. The increased security was Marcus's response to a world where his wealth had made him a symbol of everything people hated about the healthcare system. James Rodriguez had been hired as head of security 6 months earlier, brought in specifically to protect Marcus from the growing threats against pharmaceutical executives. A former Marine with 20 years of experience in corporate security, James approached his job with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that overlooking small details could have deadly consequences. James had noticed Rosa from his first week on the job, not because she was suspicious, but because her invisibility itself was noteworthy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In his experience, people who moved through secure environments without drawing attention were either exceptionally well-trained or so genuinely harmless that they had learned to become part of the background. Rosa appeared to be the latter, but James's training had taught him never to make assumptions. He had run a standard background check on all the cleaning staff when he was hired, and Rosa's file had revealed nothing concerning. She had worked for the same cleaning company for 8 years, had no criminal record, and lived quietly in Queens with her elderly mother. Her supervisor described her as reliable and hardworking, someone who preferred to work alone and never caused problems. But there were small things about Rosa that didn't quite fit the profile of a typical cleaning person. James had noticed that she sometimes paused when cleaning Marcus's office, her eyes lingering on the pharmaceutical journals scattered across his desk. He had seen her straighten papers with a care that suggested she was reading rather than simply organizing. Most tellingly, he had observed her reaction when she encountered medical equipment in the conference rooms where Blackwood Industries held presentations about their latest research. Where most people would have shown either indifference or confusion when faced with complex medical devices, Rosa displayed what looked like recognition. She handled the equipment with a familiarity that seemed inconsistent with her background, and James had caught her examining technical specifications with an intensity that suggested understanding rather than mere curiosity. These observations had prompted James to conduct a more thorough investigation into Rosa's background, though he hadn't found anything that justified his growing suspicion that there was more to her than met the eye. Her immigration records showed that she had arrived from El Salvador in 1989, had worked various cleaning and service jobs, and had raised 3 children largely on her own. One of her daughters had died 3 years earlier from a neurological condition, which explained the grief that sometimes flickered across her face when she thought no one was watching. But James's instincts, honed by years of protecting high-value targets, told him that Rosa Martinez was hiding something. It wasn't necessarily something dangerous, his threat assessment suggested she posed no physical risk to Marcus or the company. But there was an intelligence in her eyes that didn't match her position, a carefulness in her movements that suggested she was constantly aware of being observed. The first real indication that James's suspicions might be justified came on a Thursday evening in late autumn. He had been reviewing security footage from the previous night when he noticed something unusual in Rosa's behavior. She had been cleaning Marcus's office as usual, but instead of her normal efficient routine, she had spent nearly 10 minutes standing perfectly still in front of a whiteboard where Marcus had been working on calculations related to a failed clinical trial. The footage showed Rosa staring at the mathematical formulas with an intensity that was unmistakable. Then, in a moment that made James replay the video multiple times, Rosa had picked up a marker and made several small corrections to Marcus's equations. She had erased her changes immediately afterward, but not before James had captured clear images of what she had written. When James showed the enhanced footage to Dr. Patricia Chen, Blackwood Industries head of research, her reaction was immediate and profound. The corrections Rosa had made were not only accurate but demonstrated an understanding of advanced biochemistry that would have been impressive coming from a trained researcher. the equations Marcus had been struggling with related to drug absorption rates in neural tissue, and Rosa's modifications revealed a sophisticated grasp of pharmacokinetics that suggested extensive study in the field. Dr. Chen's analysis of the footage raised more questions than it answered. Where had a cleaning woman learned advanced biochemistry? Why was she working a minimum wage job when she clearly possessed knowledge that could command a six-figure salary in pharmaceutical research? And most intriguingly, what other insights might she have that could benefit their struggling research programs? Marcus Blackwood's initial reaction to James's report was skepticism bordering on disbelief. The idea that someone with Rosa's background could have meaningful contributions to make to pharmaceutical research seemed absurd. But Dr. Chen's analysis was compelling, and Marcus had learned to trust both her scientific judgment and James's security instincts. The revelation about Rosa came at a time when Marcus was particularly vulnerable to any suggestion of hope. His sister Diana's condition had worsened in recent weeks, and the experimental treatment that had been his last hope had failed to show any improvement. The neurologists treating her had essentially given up, recommending that the family consider withdrawing life support. Marcus had refused, but he was running out of options and running out of time. The possibility that someone in his own building might have insights that could help Diana was too important to ignore, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Marcus authorized James to conduct a more comprehensive investigation into Rosa's background, with specific attention to any evidence of scientific knowledge or capability. What James discovered over the following week defied every assumption about who Rosa Martinez was and what she was capable of. Through careful investigation of her financial records, he found evidence of purchases that suggested sophisticated scientific work. She had bought specialized chemicals, laboratory equipment, and scientific journals, all paid for with money orders and delivered to an address in Queens that wasn't her listed residence. The address led to a storage facility in a converted basement, and James's surveillance revealed that Rosa visited the location every evening after finishing her work at Blackwood Industries. She would arrive carrying a bag of materials and stay for several hours before returning home. The pattern suggested regular, ongoing work rather than simple storage use. James's military training had taught him patience, but the implications of his discoveries were too significant to ignore. If Rosa was conducting some kind of scientific research, it represented either a potential security threat or an unprecedented opportunity. Either way, Marcus needed to know what was happening in that basement storage room. The decision to approach Rosa directly was not made lightly. James understood that confronting her could result in her disappearance, along with whatever knowledge she possessed. But the alternative, continuing to allow an unknown scientific operation to exist within their security perimeter, was equally unacceptable. On a cold December evening, as Rosa finished her cleaning routine and prepared to leave for her secret laboratory, James was waiting by her car in the parking garage. His presence was calm but unmistakable, and Rosa's reaction told him everything he needed to know about her awareness of being discovered. She didn't show surprise or confusion. Instead, Rosa looked at James with the resigned dignity of someone who had always known this moment would come. Her hands remained steady as she unlocked her car, but her shoulders carried the weight of someone whose careful world was about to be exposed. "Mrs. Martinez," James said quietly, his voice carrying respect rather than accusation. "I think we need to talk." Rosa paused, her hand on the car door handle, and for a moment James thought she might run. But then she turned to face him fully, and he saw in her eyes the same intelligence that had first caught his attention months ago. "You know," she said simply, her accent coloring the words but her meaning perfectly clear. "I know you're hiding something," James replied. "But I don't think you're hiding it to hurt anyone. I think you're hiding it because you're trying to help." The conversation that followed in the empty parking garage would later be remembered as the moment when two worlds collided, the world of corporate pharmaceutical research and the world of desperate innovation born from personal loss. Rosa listened as James explained what they had discovered, what they suspected, and what they needed to understand. When he finished, Rosa was quiet for a long time, weighing her options and considering the consequences of revelation. Finally, she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. "If I show you," she said, "you have to promise me something." Whatever happens, whatever you find, it has to be used to help people. Not to make money. Not to make your boss richer. To help people who have no other hope. James couldn't make that promise on behalf of Marcus or Blackwood Industries, but he could see the desperate sincerity in Rosa's eyes. This wasn't about money or recognition for her. This was about something much more fundamental, the need to ensure that her daughter's death had meaning, that the work born from her grief could prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. "I can't promise you what will happen," James said honestly. "But I can promise you that Mr. Blackwood will hear your story directly. And I can promise you that if what you've discovered is real, it will be taken seriously." Rosa studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was the straightforward honesty of a man who had spent his career protecting people and understood the weight of the trust she was being asked to place in him. "Tomorrow night," she said finally. "After midnight. Come alone, and bring no cameras, no recording devices. If you betray this trust, you will destroy something that could save lives." As Rosa drove away into the December night, James was left standing in the empty parking garage with the realization that he was about to witness something that would either validate his instincts or reveal him to be a fool chasing impossible theories. But as he replayed the conversation in his mind, he was struck by the quiet authority in Rosa's voice when she spoke about saving lives. This wasn't the voice of someone deluded or desperate. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. The next 24 hours passed with excruciating slowness for both James and Rosa. James spent the time briefing Marcus on what he had discovered and what he hoped to learn. Marcus's reaction was a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope, skepticism that a cleaning woman could have developed anything of scientific value, but hope that any possibility of breakthrough was worth pursuing. Rosa spent the day in her storage room laboratory, preparing for the moment when her secret world would be exposed to scrutiny. She organized her research notes, cleaned her equipment, and rehearsed the explanations she would need to give for work that had consumed 5 years of her life. She also prepared herself emotionally for the possibility that her discovery would be stolen, patented, and profited from by the same system that had failed her daughter. But alongside her fear was a growing sense of relief. For months, she had carried the burden of her discovery alone, uncertain how to move forward, frustrated by her inability to access the resources needed to properly test and develop her compound. The prospect of finally sharing her work with someone who might be able to help was both terrifying and exhilarating. As midnight approached, James made his way through the quiet streets of Queens to the address Rosa had given him. The building was ordinary, a converted warehouse that had been divided into apartments and storage units, the kind of place where working families stored the overflow of their lives. Nothing about it suggested that it might house a discovery that could revolutionize medical treatment. Rosa was waiting for him at the building's entrance, her face serious but no longer guarded. She led him through dim hallways and down a flight of stairs to the basement level, where she stopped in front of a door marked only with the number 17. "Before I open this," she said, her hand on the key, "I need you to understand something. What you're about to see represents 5 years of my life. It represents every cent I could spare, every hour I wasn't working or sleeping or taking care of my mother. It represents my promise to my daughter that her death would not be meaningless." She paused, her eyes meeting his in the fluorescent light of the basement hallway. "If you or your employer try to steal this, to profit from it without giving back to the families who need it, I will destroy everything and disappear. Do you understand?" James nodded, recognizing the steel beneath her quiet words. This wasn't a threat, it was a statement of principle from someone who had already lost everything that mattered most to her. Rosa unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on lights that revealed a space that took James's breath away. The storage room had been transformed into a sophisticated laboratory that would have impressed researchers at any major institution. Every inch of space had been utilized with the efficiency of someone who understood both the value of equipment and the constraints of a limited budget. Along one wall stood a fume hood that Rosa had constructed from plans she'd found online, its ventilation system running quietly as it processed the air. Shelves lined with chemicals and compounds stretched from floor to ceiling, each container labeled in Rosa's careful handwriting with both common and scientific names. A microscope that must have cost several months of her salary sat at a clean workstation, surrounded by slides and documentation. But it was the organization of the space that truly revealed Rosa's scientific mind. Research notes were arranged in chronological order, with cross-references that showed the evolution of her thinking over 5 years of work. Charts and graphs covered every available wall space, tracking experimental results with the precision of a trained researcher. Computer printouts of molecular structures were pinned beside hand-drawn diagrams that showed Rosa's efforts to understand the compounds she was working with. In the center of the room stood a sophisticated piece of equipment that James couldn't identify but that clearly represented a significant investment. Rosa noticed his confusion and explained that it was a used centrifuge she had purchased from a university lab that was upgrading its equipment. She had spent weeks learning how to repair and calibrate it, teaching herself from technical manuals and online forums. "This is where it happened," Rosa said, gesturing toward a workstation covered with carefully labeled vials. "6 months ago, I synthesized the compound that I believe can treat the condition that killed my daughter. The same condition that affects your employer's sister." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "You know about Diana Blackwood?" "I clean Mr. Blackwood's office," Rosa replied simply. "I see the medical reports on his desk, the phone calls from doctors, the desperation in his face when he thinks no one is watching. I know that grief. I lived with it for 3 years." She moved to a refrigeration unit that hummed quietly in the corner and removed a small vial containing a clear liquid. "This is it. This is what I've been working toward. A compound that can repair the specific type of neural damage that characterizes the condition. In my tests, it's been able to restore function to damaged neurons and rebuild the pathways that the disease destroys." James stared at the vial, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "You've tested this?" "On cell cultures, yes. I've been able to maintain the appropriate cellular environment here." She gestured toward an incubator that sat beside the centrifuge. "The results have been consistent across multiple trials. The compound not only halts the progression of neural damage but actually reverses it." The implications of what Rosa was telling him were staggering. If her work was valid, she had accomplished something that the entire pharmaceutical industry had failed to achieve. She had developed a treatment for a condition that medical science had essentially given up on, working alone in a basement storage room with equipment that cost less than what Blackwood Industries spent on a single day of research. "Why?" James asked. "Why didn't you approach the pharmaceutical companies directly? Why didn't you try to get funding for proper clinical trials?" Rosa's laugh was bitter. "You think I didn't try? I sent emails to every major pharmaceutical company, including your employers. I called research institutions, universities, anyone who might listen. Do you know what happened? Nothing. My calls weren't returned. My emails were ignored. I'm a cleaning woman with a high school education and an accent. In their world, I don't exist." She moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder filled with printed emails and form letters. "These are the responses I received. Thank you for your interest, but we only accept research proposals from accredited institutions. Thank you for contacting us, but we don't have resources to evaluate unsolicited submissions. Thank you for thinking of us, but we recommend you consult with your physician." The dismissal in the corporate responses was clear and devastating. Rosa had tried to work within the system, but the system had no place for someone like her, regardless of what she might have discovered. "So I kept working alone," she continued. "I knew that if I could prove the compound's effectiveness, if I could document everything properly, eventually someone would have to listen. But I also knew that if I revealed my work too early, it would be stolen from me. Patented by some corporation and sold back to desperate families at prices they could never afford." James was beginning to understand the impossible position Rosa had found herself in. Her discovery was potentially revolutionary, but she lacked the institutional connections needed to develop it properly. At the same time, her suspicion of the pharmaceutical industry was entirely justified. If her compound proved effective, it would indeed be worth billions of dollars to whatever company could control its development and distribution. "What do you want?" James asked. "If this is real, if this compound works, what do you want to see happen?" Rosa's answer came without hesitation, clearly something she had thought about extensively. "I want it tested properly, in real clinical trials with proper oversight. I want it developed and manufactured so that it can reach every family that needs it. And I want it to be affordable. Not free, I understand that development costs money. But affordable. No family should have to choose between saving their child and saving their home." She paused, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "And I want my daughter's name on it. Carmen Martinez. When this compound helps people, I want them to know it came from a mother's love, not from corporate greed." Standing in that hidden laboratory, surrounded by 5 years of desperate scientific work, James understood that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Rosa Martinez had accomplished what billion-dollar research programs had failed to achieve, working alone with salvaged equipment and unshakable determination. But more than that, she had maintained her moral center throughout the process, ensuring that her discovery would serve the families who needed it rather than the corporations that could profit from it. The question now was whether Marcus Blackwood would see Rosa's work for what it truly was, not just a potential business opportunity, but a chance to honor his sister's memory by ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same loss. The answer to that question would determine not only the fate of Rosa's discovery but the direction of Blackwood Industries and possibly the future of pharmaceutical research itself. As James prepared to leave that night, carrying with him documentation that could change everything, he realized that he was no longer just a security professional protecting a client. He had become the bridge between two worlds, the world of corporate power and the world of personal determination. What happened next would depend on his ability to translate Rosa's story in a way that Marcus Blackwood could understand not just with his business mind, but with his heart. The morning after James's revelation in Rosa's laboratory, Marcus Blackwood sat in his corner office staring at photographs and documentation that challenged everything he thought he understood about scientific research. The images showed sophisticated equipment, detailed experimental logs, and molecular diagrams that would have impressed researchers at Harvard or MIT. Yet all of it had been created by a woman who cleaned his office every morning while he slept in his penthouse apartment 40 floors above. Dr. Patricia Chen had spent the entire night reviewing Rosa's documentation, and her preliminary assessment was staggering. The compound Rosa had developed appeared to target the exact cellular mechanisms that had confounded pharmaceutical researchers for decades. Her approach was innovative, combining established neurochemistry with novel molecular engineering in ways that major research institutions had never attempted. "This shouldn't be possible," Patricia said, spreading Rosa's hand-drawn molecular diagrams across Marcus's conference table. "The level of understanding required to develop this compound typically requires years of graduate study, access to specialized databases, and collaboration with teams of experts. Yet her documentation shows a clear progression from basic research to advanced synthesis over just 5 years." Marcus examined the diagrams, noting the precision of Rosa's annotations and the systematic way she had documented every experimental iteration. Could she have stolen this from somewhere? Copied existing research? "I've run her molecular structure through every database I have access to," Patricia replied. "This compound doesn't exist in any published literature. The closest analogs were abandoned by pharmaceutical companies in the 1980s because they couldn't solve the delivery problems that Rosa appears to have overcome." The implications were overwhelming. Marcus had built his fortune on identifying and acquiring promising pharmaceutical research, but he had never encountered anything like this. A cleaning woman working in isolation had potentially solved a medical puzzle that had stumped the world's leading neurologists and pharmaceutical researchers. "What's the next step?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We need to test her compound in a proper laboratory setting," Patricia said. "If her cell culture results can be replicated with standardized protocols, we'll know whether we're looking at a genuine breakthrough or an experimental artifact." But even as they discussed the scientific validation process, Marcus knew that the real challenge would be navigating the human elements of this discovery. Rosa had every reason to distrust pharmaceutical companies, and his own track record of aggressive patent acquisition and profit maximization would hardly reassure her about his intentions. James had reported that Rosa was willing to share her work, but only under specific conditions that reflected her determination to ensure the compound would be used to help families rather than enrich corporations. Her demand that the treatment remain affordable and carry her daughter's name showed that this was about legacy and justice rather than financial gain. For Marcus, the discovery represented both an unprecedented opportunity and a fundamental test of his character. He could approach Rosa's work as he had every other acquisition, identify its commercial potential, acquire controlling rights, and maximize profit margins. Or he could honor the spirit in which the research had been conducted, treating it as a collaboration rather than a conquest. The decision was complicated by Marcus's own desperate need for hope. Diana's condition had continued to deteriorate, and the experimental treatments that had been his last resort were showing no effectiveness. The possibility that Rosa's compound could help his sister added a personal urgency that made objective decision-making nearly impossible. But Marcus also recognized that his handling of this discovery would define not just the future of Rosa's research but the ethical direction of his entire company. Blackwood Industries had become synonymous with pharmaceutical profiteering, charging premium prices for essential medications and prioritizing shareholder value over patient access. Rosa's discovery offered a chance to demonstrate that profitable pharmaceutical research could coexist with genuine commitment to patient welfare. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of having legal teams draft acquisition agreements or sending corporate representatives to negotiate with Rosa, he asked James to arrange a personal meeting. He wanted to speak with Rosa directly, to understand her motivations and explain his own, before any formal arrangements were discussed. Rosa's response to the meeting request was cautious but not dismissive. She agreed to meet at Blackwood Industries the following evening, after normal business hours when the building would be empty except for security personnel. She insisted that Dr. Chen be present to discuss the scientific aspects of her work, and that James remain throughout the meeting as a neutral witness to whatever agreements might be reached. The evening of the meeting, Marcus found himself more nervous than he had been before any business negotiation in his career. He was accustomed to dealing with pharmaceutical executives, investment bankers, and regulatory officials, people who spoke his language and understood his methods. Rosa Martinez represented something entirely different, a person motivated by grief and love rather than profit and competition. Rosa arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that James recognized from her laboratory. She was dressed simply but professionally, her demeanor calm despite the magnitude of what was about to be discussed. Marcus noticed immediately that she carried herself with quiet dignity, making eye contact and shaking hands with the confidence of someone who had nothing to apologize for. "Mrs. Martinez," Marcus began, "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with us. James has told me about your work, and Dr. Chen has reviewed your documentation. What you've accomplished is extraordinary." Rosa's response was measured and direct. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't accomplish this work to impress pharmaceutical executives. I did it because my daughter died from a disease that your industry ignored because it wasn't profitable enough to research. If my compound can help other families, that's what matters. Everything else is just details." The bluntness of her statement caught Marcus off guard, but he also recognized its honesty. Rosa wasn't interested in flattery or corporate pleasantries. She wanted to know whether he could be trusted to honor the principles that had guided her research. "I understand your skepticism about pharmaceutical companies," Marcus replied. "My own company has made decisions that prioritized profits over patients, and I take responsibility for that. But I also want you to know that discovering your work has forced me to reconsider what Blackwood Industries could become." Dr. Chen stepped forward with Rosa's documentation spread across the conference table. "Mrs. Martinez, I've reviewed your research protocols and experimental results. Your work is genuinely innovative, but it needs validation through standardized testing procedures before it can move toward clinical trials. That validation requires resources and expertise that would be difficult to access outside of an institutional framework." Rosa nodded, clearly having anticipated this discussion. "I understand that my laboratory has limitations. But I also understand that once I share my complete research with a pharmaceutical company, I lose control over how it's developed and distributed. I've seen what happens to promising treatments when profit becomes the primary consideration. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that she placed in the center of the table. These are my conditions for any collaboration. First, the compound must be developed with genuine commitment to patient access, not maximum profit extraction. Second, the final treatment must be priced based on manufacturing costs plus reasonable development recovery, not whatever the market will bear. Third, Carmen Martinez's name must be permanently associated with this discovery. Marcus read through Rosa's conditions carefully, recognizing that they represented a fundamental challenge to standard pharmaceutical business practices. Drug pricing typically reflected not just development costs but also the premium that companies could charge for life-saving treatments. Rosa was essentially asking him to abandon the profit maximization model that had built his fortune. These conditions would represent a significant departure from industry standards, Marcus said carefully. The pharmaceutical business model depends on recovering massive development costs through premium pricing for successful drugs. What you're proposing would require a completely different approach. Then maybe it's time for a different approach, Rosa replied without hesitation. The current system failed my daughter and fails thousands of other families every year. If your industry can't figure out how to help people without exploiting their desperation, maybe it needs to change. The challenge in Rosa's words was unmistakable, but Marcus also heard something else, an invitation to be part of that change. She wasn't asking him to abandon profitability entirely, but to demonstrate that pharmaceutical research could serve patients and investors simultaneously. James had remained silent throughout the initial discussion, but now he spoke with the directness that Marcus had come to value. Mrs. Martinez has every reason to be suspicious of pharmaceutical companies. But she also recognizes that her discovery needs proper development to help people. The question is whether Blackwood Industries can prove it's different from the companies that ignored her research. Dr. Chen added her own perspective as a scientist who had worked within the pharmaceutical industry for 15 years. The technical validation process will require at least 6 months of intensive laboratory work. During that time, we'll be able to determine whether the compound's effectiveness can be replicated and scaled for clinical trials. But the real test will be whether we can maintain Mrs. Martinez's ethical framework throughout the development process. Marcus found himself at a crossroads that extended far beyond this single decision. Rosa's conditions would require fundamental changes to Blackwood Industries' business model, changes that would affect shareholder returns and competitive positioning. But they also offered an opportunity to transform the company into something that could generate both profit and genuine respect. The personal stakes made the decision even more complex. If Rosa's compound proved effective, it could potentially help Diana, giving Marcus's sister the chance at recovery that traditional medicine had been unable to provide. But approaching the collaboration primarily as a way to help Diana would corrupt the ethical foundation that Rosa had insisted upon. I need to be honest with you about something, Marcus said, his voice carrying vulnerability that surprised everyone in the room. My sister Diana has the same condition that killed your daughter. She's been in a vegetative state for 3 years, and traditional treatments have failed completely. I can't pretend that my interest in your work is purely altruistic. Rosa's expression softened slightly, recognizing the grief that had shaped Marcus's urgency. I wondered if that might be the case. I've seen the medical reports on your desk, and I understand the desperation of watching someone you love disappear into a disease you can't fight. But, she continued with firmness returning to her voice, your sister's condition can't become an excuse to shortcut the ethical development of this treatment. If my compound works, it needs to work for everyone who needs it, not just for people wealthy enough to afford premium pricing. Marcus nodded, understanding that Rosa was offering him a path toward redemption rather than just a business opportunity. The collaboration she envisioned would require him to prove that pharmaceutical research could serve a higher purpose than quarterly profit targets. If we move forward, Marcus said, I want you to be involved in every stage of the development process. Not as a consultant or advisor, but as a full partner in ensuring that your ethical standards are maintained throughout. Rosa studied his face carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or false sincerity. What she saw instead was a man genuinely grappling with the implications of her challenge, someone who recognized that this decision would define his legacy as much as hers. "I'll need more than promises," Rosa said. "I'll need legal guarantees that the development process will honor my conditions, and I'll need ongoing oversight authority to ensure those guarantees are respected." Dr. Chen interjected with practical considerations that would affect the collaboration structure. "Mrs. Martinez, the validation process will require you to share your complete research methodology, including proprietary techniques you've developed. Once that information is disclosed, it becomes extremely difficult to protect if the collaboration fails." "I understand the risks," Rosa replied. "But I also understand that keeping my research secret helps no one. If Mr. Blackwood and Blackwood Industries can prove they're committed to ethical development, then the risk is worth taking." The discussion continued late into the evening as they worked through the practical and legal frameworks that would govern their collaboration. Rosa's conditions required creative solutions that challenged standard pharmaceutical agreements, but Marcus found himself energized by the complexity rather than frustrated by it. By the time they concluded the meeting, the outlines of an unprecedented partnership had emerged. Rosa would work directly with Dr. Chen's research team to validate and refine her compound, while maintaining oversight authority over pricing and distribution decisions. Blackwood Industries would provide the resources and expertise needed for clinical trials, while committing to a pricing structure based on treatment accessibility rather than profit maximization. The agreement also included provisions for Rosa to establish a foundation in Carmen's name, funded by a percentage of any profits from the compound's commercialization. The foundation would support research into rare neurological conditions and provide treatment assistance for families who couldn't afford pharmaceutical interventions. As Rosa prepared to leave that evening, she turned to Marcus with an observation that would stay with him long after she had gone. "Mr. Blackwood, you've built an empire by acquiring other people's discoveries and maximizing their commercial value. This time, you have the chance to build something different. Something that your sister would be proud of, and something that my daughter's memory can live within." The words carried both challenge and hope, recognizing that Marcus's decision to honor Rosa's ethical framework would require him to fundamentally reimagine his role in the pharmaceutical industry. But they also offered him the possibility of redemption, the chance to transform Blackwood Industries from a symbol of pharmaceutical greed into a model of ethical research and development. Over the following weeks, as Rosa began working with Dr. Chen's team to validate her compound, Marcus found himself transformed by the collaboration in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching Rosa explain her research to PhD scientists with patience and precision, he began to understand that intelligence and insight could emerge from unexpected places and circumstances. Rosa's presence in the Blackwood Industries research facility challenged every assumption about expertise and authority that had shaped Marcus's career. She had developed groundbreaking pharmaceutical research without institutional support, advanced degrees, or corporate resources. Her success forced Marcus to confront how many other discoveries might have been overlooked simply because they originated outside the established academic and corporate hierarchies. The validation process itself proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Rosa's compound showed consistent effectiveness in laboratory testing, but replicating her results required understanding techniques she had developed through years of experimentation. Her improvised equipment had produced results that sophisticated laboratory instruments couldn't immediately match, forcing Dr. Chen's team to reverse engineer Rosa's methodology. "She's developed workarounds for problems that we solve with million-dollar equipment," Dr. Chen explained to Marcus during one of their weekly progress meetings. "Her centrifuge techniques compensate for calibration limitations that would normally require computer-controlled precision. Her compound storage methods maintain stability without expensive refrigeration systems. It's like she's created an entirely parallel approach to pharmaceutical research." The more Marcus learned about Rosa's work, the more he recognized that her isolation from the pharmaceutical establishment had been both a limitation and an advantage. While she lacked access to advanced equipment and collaborative expertise, she also hadn't been constrained by industry assumptions about what was possible or practical. Rosa's compound represented a fundamentally different approach to treating neurological conditions, one that hadn't been explored by major pharmaceutical companies because it didn't fit within their established research paradigms. Her breakthrough had emerged from combining different scientific disciplines in ways that institutional researchers rarely attempted. But the validation process also revealed the limitations of working outside established scientific frameworks. Rosa's documentation, while meticulous by any standard, lacked some of the standardized protocols that would be required for regulatory approval. Her experimental controls, though effective for her purposes, needed modification to meet FDA requirements for clinical trials. Dr. Chen worked closely with Rosa to address these challenges, but the process required patience and mutual respect that transcended traditional hierarchies. Rosa's expertise in her compound's development was unquestionable, but she needed guidance in navigating regulatory requirements that would determine whether her discovery could reach patients. The collaboration between Rosa and Dr. Chen became a model for how the broader partnership between Rosa and Blackwood Industries would function. Rather than simply acquiring Rosa's research and excluding her from further development, Marcus insisted that she remain central to every decision that would affect the compound's future. This approach required significant changes to Blackwood Industries' standard operating procedures. Rosa's oversight authority meant that pricing, distribution, and marketing decisions would need her approval, giving her veto power over strategies that conflicted with her ethical standards. Some members of Marcus's executive team questioned whether these constraints would make the compound's development commercially viable. The pharmaceutical industry depended on premium pricing for successful drugs to offset the massive costs of failed research programs. Rosa's insistence on affordable pricing threatened to undermine the economic model that had built Blackwood Industries' success. But Marcus had begun to see Rosa's ethical framework not as a constraint on profitability but as an opportunity to pioneer a new approach to pharmaceutical business. If Blackwood Industries could prove that ethical development and reasonable pricing could coexist with sustainable profits, they would differentiate themselves in an industry increasingly criticized for prioritizing investor returns over patient welfare. The potential market for Rosa's compound was enormous, affecting hundreds of thousands of patients worldwide who suffered from the same condition that had killed Carmen and continued to threaten Diana. Even with affordable pricing, the volume of potential sales could generate substantial revenues for Blackwood Industries while providing life-saving treatment to families who had been abandoned by traditional pharmaceutical research. Marcus also recognized that Rosa's story would transform public perception of Blackwood Industries in ways that no marketing campaign could achieve. The narrative of a grieving mother whose basement laboratory had produced breakthrough research would demonstrate the company's commitment to supporting innovation regardless of its source. But the collaboration's success would ultimately depend on whether Rosa's compound proved effective in clinical trials. Laboratory validation was encouraging, but the real test would come when the treatment was administered to patients under controlled medical supervision. The first clinical trial was scheduled to begin within 6 months, assuming that regulatory approvals could be obtained and sufficient patient volunteers could be recruited. Marcus had committed unprecedented resources to ensuring the trial's success, but he also understood that no amount of money could guarantee positive results. As the validation process continued, Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time in the research facility, observing Rosa's work and learning about pharmaceutical development from an entirely new perspective. Her approach to problem-solving was methodical but creative, combining rigorous scientific principles with innovative thinking that challenged conventional assumptions. Rosa had also begun to trust Marcus's commitment to their collaboration, though she remained vigilant about protecting her ethical standards. She appreciated his willingness to involve her in strategic decisions and his genuine interest in understanding her research beyond its commercial potential. The personal relationship between Marcus and Rosa evolved from mutual suspicion to cautious respect to something approaching friendship. They were united by their shared experience of watching loved ones suffer from the same devastating condition, and by their determination to ensure that other families wouldn't endure the same loss. Diana's condition provided a constant reminder of the stakes involved in their collaboration. Marcus visited his sister weekly, sharing updates about Rosa's research and hoping for any sign of improvement. the experimental treatments that had been his last hope before Rosa's discovery had been discontinued after showing no effectiveness. Rosa occasionally accompanied Marcus on these visits, her presence providing comfort that extended beyond medical expertise. She understood the helplessness of watching someone you love disappear into a disease that defied treatment, and her quiet support helped Marcus maintain hope during the most difficult periods. But Rosa also insisted that Diana's condition couldn't drive the timeline for clinical trials or compromise the ethical standards that govern the compound's development. Personal urgency couldn't justify shortcuts that might endanger other patients or undermine the research's integrity. The balance between hope and patience proved challenging for Marcus, who was accustomed to controlling timelines and outcomes through financial resources and corporate influence. Rosa's compound offered genuine hope for Diana's recovery, but only if the development process maintained a scientific rigor that would ensure the treatment's safety and effectiveness. As winter turned to spring, the validation process approached completion with results that exceeded even Rosa's optimistic expectations. Her compound had proven consistently effective across multiple testing protocols, showing not just the ability to halt neurological damage but to actively repair damaged neural pathways. Dr. Chen's final validation report described Rosa's compound as representing a fundamental breakthrough in neurological treatment, with potential applications extending beyond the specific condition that had motivated its development. The molecular mechanisms that Rosa had identified could potentially address multiple neurological disorders that had previously been considered untreatable. The success of the validation process brought both celebration and new challenges. Rosa's compound was ready to move into clinical trials, but the expanded scope of its potential applications raised questions about how broadly it should be tested and developed. Marcus found himself facing decisions that would affect not just the treatment of Rosa's target condition but the future of neurological medicine more broadly. The compound's potential justified massive investment in clinical trials and manufacturing capabilities, but it also intensified the pressure to maximize its commercial value. Rosa remained focused on her original goal of helping families affected by her daughter's condition, but she also recognized the broader implications of her discovery. If her compound could help people with other neurological disorders, she had a moral obligation to ensure that those applications were pursued. The discussions about expanding clinical trials brought Rosa and Marcus into closer collaboration as they worked to balance scientific opportunity with ethical responsibility. The decisions they made would determine whether Rosa's discovery would fulfill its potential to transform neurological medicine while maintaining the principles that had guided its development. As they prepared to announce the beginning of clinical trials, both Rosa and Marcus understood that they were entering a new phase of their partnership. The validation process had proven that Rosa's compound was scientifically viable, but the clinical trials would determine whether it could actually help patients while maintaining the ethical standards that had defined their collaboration. The success or failure of the clinical trials would affect not just the patients who participated but the future of pharmaceutical research more broadly. If Rosa's approach proved that ethical development and patient accessibility could coexist with commercial success, it would provide a model for transforming an industry that had increasingly prioritized profits over patients. But if the trials failed, or if the ethical constraints proved incompatible with sustainable business practices, it would reinforce the industry's skepticism about alternative approaches to pharmaceutical development. The stakes extended far beyond Rosa's compound to encompass fundamental questions about how medical research should be conducted and who should benefit from its results. Standing at the threshold of clinical trials, Rosa and Marcus had created something unprecedented in the pharmaceutical industry, a partnership that honored both scientific excellence and ethical responsibility. Whether that partnership could survive the pressures and complexities of bringing a new treatment to market would determine not just the fate of Rosa's discovery but the possibility of transforming pharmaceutical research to serve patients rather than simply profit from their suffering. The first clinical trial began on a humid Tuesday morning in July, 18 months after James had first discovered Rosa's secret laboratory. The medical facility that Marcus had selected for the trials was located in Boston, chosen specifically for its reputation in neurological research and its commitment to patient-centered care. Dr. Sarah Williams, the neurologist overseeing the trial, had initially been skeptical about testing a compound developed outside traditional pharmaceutical channels, but Rosa's validation data had convinced her that the research deserved serious consideration. 24 patients had been enrolled in the initial trial, all suffering from the same rare neurological condition that had claimed Carmen Martinez and continued to threaten Diana Blackwood. The patients ranged in age from 8 to 67, representing families from across the economic spectrum who had exhausted conventional treatment options. Each participant understood that they were testing an experimental compound with unknown risks, but they also understood that without intervention, their condition would inevitably progress to complete neurological shutdown. Rosa had insisted on meeting every trial participant personally before treatment began. She spent hours with each family, explaining her research journey and ensuring they understood both the potential benefits and risks of her compound. These conversations were emotionally difficult for Rosa, as each patient reminded her of Carmen's struggle, but she felt obligated to look into the faces of the people who would trust her discovery with their lives. Marcus observed these interactions with growing respect for Rosa's commitment to the human dimension of pharmaceutical research. He had participated in dozens of clinical trials during his career, but they had always been abstractions to him, statistical analyses and profit projections rather than individual stories of hope and desperation. Watching Rosa hold the hand of a frightened 8-year-old while explaining the treatment process in terms the child could understand forced Marcus to confront the reality of what pharmaceutical research meant to the families it served. Dr. Williams had designed the trial protocol to maximize both scientific rigor and patient safety. Half the participants would receive Rosa's compound, while the other half would receive a placebo, though all families understood that those receiving the placebo would have access to the actual treatment if it proved effective. The trial would continue for 6 months, with regular monitoring to track both improvements and potential side effects. The first week of the trial passed without dramatic developments, though Rosa's careful observation detected subtle changes in several patients receiving her compound. Sleep patterns improved, muscle tension decreased, and cognitive responses showed marginal enhancement. These early signs were encouraging but not definitive, falling within the range of normal variation that characterized neurological conditions. But during the second week, something unprecedented occurred. Michael Chen, a 14-year-old boy who had been non-responsive for 3 months before entering the trial, opened his eyes during his morning evaluation and spoke his first words in nearly a year. His mother's sobs of joy echoed through the medical facility as Michael asked for water in a voice that was weak but unmistakably clear. Dr. Williams immediately conducted comprehensive neurological assessments to verify that Michael's improvement was genuine rather than a temporary fluctuation. The results were remarkable. Brain activity in regions that had shown minimal function for months was approaching normal levels. Motor control was returning gradually, and cognitive processing showed steady enhancement. Rosa was present for Michael's evaluation, and the moment when he recognized her as the woman who had developed his treatment became one of the most emotionally overwhelming experiences of her life. Michael's grateful smile reminded her viscerally of Carmen during her daughter's final lucid moments, creating a connection between loss and hope that validated every hour she had spent in her basement laboratory. Word of Michael's improvement spread quickly through the trial facility, creating a mixture of excitement and cautious optimism among the medical staff. Dr. Williams emphasized that a single patient's response couldn't predict the compound's overall effectiveness, but she also acknowledged that the speed and extent of Michael's improvement exceeded anything she had witnessed in 30 years of neurological practice. Within a month, 6 of the 12 patients receiving Rosa's compound showed significant improvement in neurological function. The changes varied in degree and speed, but the pattern was consistent. Patients who had been steadily declining began stabilizing and then recovering capabilities that conventional medicine had considered permanently lost. The trial's success attracted attention from neurological researchers worldwide, but it also created pressure that threatened to overwhelm both Rosa and Marcus. Pharmaceutical companies began approaching Marcus with acquisition offers for Rosa's compound, while medical institutions invited Rosa to present her research at conferences she had never imagined attending. Rosa found herself thrust into a world of scientific celebrity that felt completely disconnected from the grief and determination that had motivated her research. Journalists wanted to interview the cleaning woman who had revolutionized neurological medicine, while venture capitalists sought meetings to discuss commercialization strategies that ignored the ethical framework Rosa had insisted upon. The attention was flattering but also deeply concerning to Rosa, who recognized that her compound's success was attracting exactly the kind of profit-focused interest she had sought to avoid. The pharmaceutical industry's enthusiasm for her discovery seemed to focus entirely on its commercial potential rather than its capacity to help suffering families. Marcus became Rosa's protector against these pressures, using his industry connections and legal resources to shield her from opportunistic approaches that would compromise the ethical development of her compound. But he also found himself grappling with temptations that challenged his own commitment to Rosa's principles. The commercial value of Rosa's compound was becoming apparent as trial results continued to exceed expectations. Conservative estimates suggested that the treatment could generate billions of dollars in revenue annually, even with the affordable pricing structure that Rosa had demanded. Investment analysts were describing the compound as potentially the most valuable pharmaceutical discovery of the decade. But Marcus also understood that betraying Rosa's trust would destroy not only their partnership but his own chance at redemption. The transformation he had undergone since discovering Rosa's work wasn't just about changing Blackwood Industries' business practices, it was about becoming someone worthy of the respect that Rosa had cautiously begun to offer him. The most significant test of their partnership came when Diana Blackwood was accepted into a compassionate use program that would allow her to receive Rosa's compound before the clinical trials were complete. The FDA had approved the program based on the dramatic improvements seen in trial participants and the absence of serious side effects. Marcus struggled with conflicting emotions as he prepared to authorize Diana's treatment. His sister's condition had deteriorated significantly during the months of clinical trials, and her neurologists had begun discussing end-of-life care options. Rosa's compound represented Diana's last hope for recovery, but Marcus also understood that his sister's treatment would be closely scrutinized by medical professionals and media outlets monitoring the compound's development. Rosa insisted on personally overseeing Diana's treatment, recognizing that any complications or failures would be attributed to her research. She also understood that Diana's recovery or continued decline would profoundly affect Marcus's emotional state and his commitment to their partnership. The first administration of Rosa's compound to Diana took place on a September morning when autumn light filtered through the windows of the medical facility's private treatment room. Marcus sat beside his sister's bed, holding her hand while Rosa prepared the injection with steady fingers that belied her emotional turmoil. Diana's response to the treatment was neither immediate nor dramatic, but within days, subtle changes began to emerge. Her muscle tension decreased, her sleep patterns normalized, and brain activity monitors showed increasing neural function in regions that had been dormant for years. 2 weeks after beginning treatment, Diana opened her eyes during Marcus's daily visit and focused on his face with recognition that had been absent for 3 years. Her first word was his name, spoken in a whisper that carried the accumulated longing of their separation. Marcus's emotional response to Diana's awakening was overwhelming, combining relief, gratitude, and a profound understanding of what Rosa's discovery meant to families worldwide. Watching his sister slowly return to consciousness gave him visceral appreciation for the gift that Rosa had given not just to him but to every family affected by neurological conditions that had previously been considered hopeless. But Diana's recovery also intensified the pressure surrounding Rosa's compound and forced both Rosa and Marcus to confront the broader implications of their collaboration. The treatment's success in high-profile cases was attracting international attention and creating demand that would be impossible to satisfy with the small-scale production capabilities they had established. Scaling production to meet global demand would require massive investment in manufacturing facilities, regulatory approvals in multiple countries, and distribution networks that could reach patients worldwide. These requirements exceeded anything that Rosa and Marcus could manage through their existing partnership, forcing them to consider bringing in additional partners or investors. Rosa remained adamant that any expansion of their collaboration must honor the ethical principles that had guided the compound's development. She insisted that pricing remain based on treatment accessibility rather than profit maximization, and that a significant portion of revenues be directed toward research into other rare neurological conditions. The challenge was finding partners who would accept these constraints while providing the resources needed to bring Rosa's compound to patients worldwide. Most pharmaceutical companies were accustomed to maximizing profits from successful drugs to offset the costs of failed research programs, making Rosa's pricing philosophy incompatible with industry standards. Marcus proposed creating a new organizational structure that would allow ethical development while providing sustainable financing for global distribution. The Carmen Martinez Foundation would own the compound's intellectual property and license production to pharmaceutical companies under strict pricing and distribution agreements. Profits above agreed thresholds would fund research into rare diseases that traditional pharmaceutical companies ignored. This structure would allow Rosa to maintain control over her compound's development while leveraging the pharmaceutical industry's expertise in manufacturing and distribution. It would also create a sustainable model for ethical pharmaceutical research that could inspire similar approaches to other medical discoveries. The proposal required extensive legal and financial planning, but it offered a path toward honoring Rosa's principles while meeting the global demand for her life-saving treatment. The foundation structure would ensure that Carmen Martinez's name remained permanently associated with the compound while creating a legacy that extended far beyond any single discovery. As they worked to establish this new framework, Rosa and Marcus found their partnership evolving into something that transcended their original collaboration. They had become advocates for a fundamental transformation of pharmaceutical research, demonstrating that ethical principles and commercial success could coexist when properly structured. The media attention surrounding their partnership began to focus on the broader implications of their approach rather than just the compound's medical effectiveness. Business journals analyzed their innovative organizational structure, while medical publications examined the potential for patient-centered drug development to replace profit-maximizing strategies. Rosa found herself uncomfortable with this attention but recognized its importance for inspiring similar collaborations between unconventional researchers and established pharmaceutical companies. Her story was encouraging other researchers working outside traditional institutions to pursue their discoveries despite lacking formal credentials or corporate support. Marcus used his industry connections to promote their model of ethical pharmaceutical development, speaking at conferences and working with policymakers to create incentives for patient-centered research. He had transformed from a symbol of pharmaceutical greed into an advocate for industry reform, using his platform to challenge colleagues to reconsider their priorities. The first year of Rosa's compound's availability to patients worldwide exceeded every projection for both medical effectiveness and commercial success. More than 10,000 patients had received the treatment, with success rates approaching 90% across all age groups and disease severities. The affordable pricing structure had made the treatment accessible to families regardless of their economic circumstances, fulfilling Rosa's commitment to ensuring that financial resources wouldn't determine access to life-saving medicine. The compound's success had also validated the financial viability of ethical pharmaceutical development. Despite charging significantly less than comparable treatments, the Carmen Martinez Foundation had generated sufficient revenue to fund extensive research into 12 other rare neurological conditions. The Foundation's research grants had attracted scientists from leading institutions worldwide, creating a collaborative network focused on diseases that traditional pharmaceutical companies had abandoned. But perhaps the most significant impact of Rosa's discovery was the transformation it had inspired in both her own life and Marcus's understanding of his purpose. Rosa had evolved from an invisible cleaning woman into a respected researcher whose innovative approach to pharmaceutical development was being studied by business schools and medical institutions worldwide. Marcus had discovered that using his wealth and influence to serve patients rather than exploit them provided satisfaction that exceeded any financial achievement of his career. Blackwood Industries had become synonymous with ethical pharmaceutical research, attracting investors who valued social impact alongside financial returns. Their partnership had also created a new model for addressing rare diseases that affected small patient populations. Traditional pharmaceutical companies had little incentive to research conditions that would never generate blockbuster profits, leaving families like Rosa's without hope for treatment. The foundation structure they had pioneered offered sustainable financing for research into diseases that served human need rather than market demand. As the second year of global distribution began, Rosa and Marcus faced decisions about expanding their model to other medical discoveries and researchers. They had received proposals from scientists working on treatments for rare cancers, genetic disorders, and autoimmune conditions who wanted to develop their research within an ethical framework similar to the Carmen Martinez Foundation. These opportunities excited Rosa, who recognized that her personal tragedy could become the foundation for transforming medical research more broadly. But they also required careful consideration of how to scale their approach without losing the personal commitment and ethical oversight that had made their partnership successful. Marcus proposed establishing a network of foundations modeled on their collaboration, each focused on specific medical conditions but sharing resources and expertise across diseases and research programs. This approach would allow them to support multiple researchers while maintaining the patient-centered focus that had defined their work. The network structure would also create opportunities for researchers like Rosa who possessed innovative insights but lacked institutional support or formal credentials. By providing resources and mentorship rather than acquiring intellectual property rights, the foundation network could nurture discoveries that might otherwise remain hidden in basement laboratories or abandoned due to lack of funding. Rosa agreed to help develop this expanded model, but she insisted that each new collaboration must honor the same ethical principles that had guided her compound's development. Researchers would retain control over their discoveries, pricing would prioritize patient access, and profits would fund further research rather than enrich investors. The announcement of the Foundation Network attracted international attention and inspired similar initiatives in other countries. Medical researchers, patient advocacy groups, and philanthropic organizations began collaborating on projects that prioritized human welfare over commercial returns. But Rosa remained focused on the personal dimension of her work, continuing to meet with families affected by neurological conditions and ensuring that her compound reached patients who needed it most urgently. She never forgot that behind every statistical analysis and financial projection were real people facing the same desperation that had motivated her research after Carmen's death. 3 years after James had first discovered her secret laboratory, Rosa stood before an international conference of neurological researchers, sharing the stage with Marcus as they presented their model of ethical pharmaceutical development. The audience included scientists, policymakers, and patient advocates from dozens of countries, all seeking to understand how their collaboration had achieved both medical breakthrough and commercial success while maintaining unwavering commitment to patient welfare. Rosa's presentation focused on the scientific aspects of her research, but she concluded with personal reflections that moved many audience members to tears. She spoke about Carmen's struggle and death, about the years of isolation and determination that had led to her discovery, and about the responsibility she felt to ensure that her daughter's legacy would serve families facing similar challenges. Marcus followed with analysis of the business model they had created, demonstrating how ethical constraints had actually enhanced rather than limited their commercial success. He described the satisfaction of building wealth through service rather than exploitation, and challenged his colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between profit and patient welfare. The conference concluded with announcements of new research collaborations inspired by Rosa and Marcus's partnership. Universities, pharmaceutical companies, and patient advocacy groups had committed to supporting unconventional researchers working on rare diseases, creating opportunities for discoveries that might otherwise remain hidden. As Rosa and Marcus returned to their continuing work, they carried with them the knowledge that Carmen Martinez's legacy had extended far beyond any single medical discovery. Their collaboration had demonstrated that personal tragedy could be transformed into hope for countless families, and that ethical principles could guide profitable business practices when leaders had the courage to prioritize purpose over profit. Rosa continued to work in her laboratory, now expanded and properly equipped but still guided by the same determination that had sustained her through years of solitary research. She had proven that intelligence and insight could emerge from unexpected places, and that the most important medical discoveries might come from researchers motivated by love rather than ambition. Marcus had discovered that true success meant using his resources to serve others rather than himself, and that the pharmaceutical industry could honor both shareholders and patients when properly structured and ethically guided. His transformation from symbol of corporate greed to advocate for patient welfare had shown that even the most entrenched business practices could be changed when leaders committed to higher purposes. Together, they had created something unprecedented in medical history, a sustainable model for developing life-saving treatments that served human need rather than market demand. Their partnership proved that ethical pharmaceutical research was not only possible but potentially more successful than traditional profit-maximizing approaches. The Carmen Martinez Foundation continued to grow, supporting researchers worldwide who shared Rosa's commitment to patient-centered drug development. Each new discovery honored Carmen's memory while providing hope to families facing medical challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable. As Rosa reflected on the journey from her daughter's death to global transformation of pharmaceutical research, she understood that grief could become a force for healing when channeled through determination and ethical purpose. Carmen's legacy would live on in every life saved by Rosa's compound and every family helped by researchers working within the foundation network they had created. The secret laboratory in a Queens basement had become the foundation for a new approach to medical research, proving that the most important discoveries often emerged from the most unexpected places and that love could indeed change the world when guided by science and sustained by ethical conviction. 5 years had passed since that December evening when James discovered Rosa's hidden laboratory, and the world of pharmaceutical research had been forever altered. The Carmen Martinez Foundation now operated research facilities on 4 continents, supporting over 200 independent researchers working on treatments for rare diseases that had been abandoned by traditional pharmaceutical companies. Rosa Martinez, once invisible in the corridors of corporate America, had become one of the most influential figures in global medical research. Time magazine had featured her on their cover as Person of the Year, while medical journals published her insights on patient-centered drug development. Yet she remained grounded in the same principles that had guided her work in that Queens basement, never forgetting the grief that had sparked her journey toward discovery. Marcus Blackwood had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The man who had once symbolized pharmaceutical greed now served as chairman of the International Coalition for Ethical Medical Research, using his wealth and influence to promote patient welfare over profit maximization. Blackwood Industries had become a model for socially responsible pharmaceutical development, inspiring competitors to adopt similar approaches to drug pricing and patient access. Diana Blackwood had made a complete recovery, returning to her career as an environmental lawyer with renewed purpose and energy. She had become a fierce advocate for medical research funding, working with Rosa to ensure that families affected by rare diseases received the support and hope they deserved. Her recovery stood as living proof of what could be accomplished when brilliant minds were given the resources and recognition they merited. The foundation's success had created ripple effects throughout the medical research community. Universities began actively recruiting unconventional researchers whose innovative approaches might lead to breakthrough discoveries. Venture capital firms established funds specifically for patient-centered pharmaceutical development. Government agencies modified their approval processes to accommodate research conducted outside traditional institutional frameworks. Rosa's compound had helped more than 50,000 patients worldwide, with success rates that continued to exceed all projections. The treatment's affordability had made it accessible to families regardless of their economic circumstances, fulfilling Rosa's original promise that desperation would never again determine access to life-saving medicine. Manufacturing facilities in developing countries ensured global distribution while providing economic opportunities in regions that had been excluded from pharmaceutical production. The Foundation network had expanded to address dozens of rare diseases, each research program guided by the ethical principles that Rosa and Marcus had established. Researchers retained ownership of their discoveries while receiving the resources needed to develop treatments properly. Patients participated as partners in the research process rather than mere subjects for experimentation. James Rodriguez had become the Foundation's Director of Global Security, protecting researchers whose work challenged established pharmaceutical interests. His military background proved invaluable in safeguarding scientists who faced intimidation from competitors unwilling to embrace ethical development practices. The threats were real but manageable, and James took pride in ensuring that innovative research could proceed without fear of corporate retaliation. Dr. Patricia Chen had left Blackwood Industries to become the Foundation's chief scientific officer, overseeing research collaborations that span continents and disciplines. Her experience bridging traditional pharmaceutical research with Rosa's unconventional approaches had made her an expert in fostering innovation while maintaining scientific rigor. Under her guidance, the Foundation had achieved breakthrough discoveries in fields ranging from pediatric oncology to genetic neurological disorders. The basement storage room in Queens had been converted into a museum and educational center, preserved exactly as Rosa had arranged it during her years of solitary research. Students from around the world visited to understand how determination and creativity could overcome institutional barriers. The space served as inspiration for aspiring researchers who lacked traditional credentials but possessed innovative ideas and unwavering commitment. Rosa still lived in the same Queens neighborhood, though her home had been expanded to accommodate the steady stream of researchers, journalists, and patients who sought her guidance. She had established a scholarship program for students from immigrant families, providing opportunities for young people whose backgrounds might otherwise exclude them from scientific careers. The program honored Carmen's memory while ensuring that future generations would have chances that Rosa herself had been denied. Marcus had endowed research chairs at 12 universities, specifically designated for investigating rare diseases that affected fewer than 10,000 patients globally. These positions attracted brilliant scientists who might otherwise focus on more commercially viable research areas. The chairs had produced significant advances in understanding genetic disorders, autoimmune conditions, and developmental disabilities that had received little attention from traditional pharmaceutical research. The transformation of pharmaceutical research had not occurred without resistance from established interests. Some companies had attempted to undermine the Foundation's work through legal challenges and regulatory complaints. Competitors had tried to replicate Rosa's compound without honoring the ethical framework that governed its development. These efforts had largely failed, however, as patients and advocacy groups had become powerful allies in protecting patient-centered research approaches. Medical schools had begun incorporating Rosa's story into their curricula, teaching future physicians about the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source. Business schools analyzed the Foundation's organizational structure as a case study in sustainable social enterprise. Policymakers examined the regulatory innovations that had enabled unconventional researchers to contribute to pharmaceutical development. The global impact of Rosa's discovery extended beyond medical treatment to encompass broader questions about innovation, opportunity, and social justice. Her success had demonstrated that brilliant insights could emerge from unexpected circumstances when people were given resources and recognition. The Foundation network had created pathways for researchers whose backgrounds might otherwise exclude them from contributing to scientific advancement. Rosa often reflected on the journey from Carmen's death to global transformation of medical research. The grief that had once threatened to overwhelm her had become a force for healing that touched families worldwide. Her daughter's legacy lived on in every patient helped by Foundation-supported research and every researcher given opportunities to pursue innovative discoveries. The Carmen Martinez Foundation had proven that love could indeed change the world when combined with scientific rigor and ethical commitment. Rosa's transformation from invisible cleaning woman to global advocate for patient-centered research had inspired countless others to pursue their own unconventional paths toward meaningful contribution. Marcus had discovered that true wealth lay not in accumulating resources but in using them to serve purposes greater than personal gain. His partnership with Rosa had taught him that business success and social responsibility were not competing values but complementary aspects of meaningful achievement. Blackwood Industries continued to generate substantial profits while maintaining unwavering commitment to patient welfare. As Rosa and Marcus looked toward the future, they saw endless possibilities for expanding their model of ethical pharmaceutical development. New technologies were emerging that could accelerate drug discovery while reducing costs. Global collaboration was becoming easier as communication barriers diminished. Most importantly, a new generation of researchers was embracing patient-centered approaches as the standard for medical innovation. The secret laboratory in Queens had become the seat of a global movement that prioritized human welfare over profit maximization. Rosa's compound had saved tens of thousands of lives while proving that ethical constraints could enhance rather than limit commercial success. The Foundation network continued to grow, supporting researchers whose diverse backgrounds and innovative approaches promised future breakthroughs in treating diseases that had previously seemed hopeless. Carmen Martinez's name would forever be associated with the transformation of pharmaceutical research from profit-driven exploitation to patient-centered healing. Her mother's promise had been fulfilled beyond anything Rosa could have imagined during those dark years of solitary research. The basement laboratory had indeed changed medical history, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that hope could emerge from the most unexpected places when guided by love and sustained by unwavering determination. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.